Hello Internet! Gino, aka That Pinguino, here again with another deep look. This time, I'm going to be taking a look at the Souls series, and in particular, I'm going to be looking at how to make these games a little bit more accessible to new players. Now, when I say accessible, I don't mean easier, I don't mean simpler, I just mean these games need a little bit better way of teaching new players how to play them. Because until I played Dark Souls with a kind of Souls Sherpa, explaining exactly where I needed to go, what all the stats did, and what was significant about my character, I just got no enjoyment out of this series. It was really having a person sit down with me, explain what was going on, and then point me in the right direction in terms of wikis and other external sources that I got any enjoyment out of this series. And I think that that's a failure on the part of these games, because there are mechanics here that are fun, there are systems here that are interesting and very different from other games that are coming out right now, but these games have such a terrible onboarding process and terrible reputation that it drives new players away, and it stops new players from really experiencing all that these games have to offer. So one of the first really simple changes that I would recommend is that at the beginning of a Souls game, it should prompt you with a question: have you played a Souls game before, yes or no? And it should tailor your game a little bit towards which choice you made. If you chose yes, then you don't have to go through a tutorial, it doesn't explain anything, and you get the hard experience full of exploration that you crave. If you pick no, then maybe restrict some of the early choices and force a player through a tutorial. Now, one of the early choices that could very easily be restricted is the class choice that you make early on in the game. Now, Demon Souls was by far the worst in terms of explaining what each of the early classes actually meant, but Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 also do a pretty bad job. Now, in each of these games, it shows you the different stats that your character will start with, and maybe it will show you weapons. However, if you're a true new player, you won't really know what each of those stats governs. Each of the weapons, you will have no real idea about the different animations and the different playstyles. You might have an inkling, okay, I understand what a knight means in terms of other games I've played and in terms of just mythology and history. I'll understand what a knight is, but in terms of a Souls game, how that character plays in practice is quite different. Like, picking a thief in these games is pretty significantly different than picking a barbarian, even though both of them deal physical damage. And it's not because the thief can steal and the barbarian can't. It's because all of the animations of the dagger are really different from the club. And so I think a really easy way to solve this problem would be to allow players to control each of the character classes in kind of a training room before you commit to that choice. Because otherwise, you put a player in a position where they could choose a class, get an hour or two into the game, realize that they don't like the class at all, or that they're just not having a good time because they chose the wrong class and they don't realize that it's a class issue, and then they quit. Whereas if you let a player play around, maybe in a training room against some really basic enemies, and see how their class controls and how dodging works, and how magic works if they choose a magic class, that might sway people towards some of the better choices. Also, removing some of the more obtuse choices, like the depraved or some of the magic classes, if the magic system is really hard to grapple with, that could also save players a lot of headaches. Maybe pushing people towards the royal in Dark Souls, in Demon Souls, so that they understand this is an easier experience, this will make things a little bit more enjoyable for you if you don't know what's going on. Or pushing people towards a really extreme melee class that's easier to grapple with. Another big change, I would think, is in Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2, you can pick a starting item. However, the game presents you with some of these items that are expendable or useless to the naked eye. Giving a new player the choice to pick something that is functionally useless to them or only single use, when there are items like the life ring that are endlessly useful and make the game a lot simpler, I think does a disservice to the Souls games. Just limit the choices to the ones that would really help a new player if they say, I've never played a Souls game before. Another little point of difficulty is the actual stat screen itself. It is huge and kind of scary. It gives you a lot of stats. You might not have any way to put them into context. Now, you'll know that strength governs how much damage you do, and dexterity kind of governs damage, but without deliberately explaining strength governs how you wield some of the heavier weapons in the game, and dexterity determines things like halberds and knives, it can be hard for a new player. Also, things like blunt damage, stab damage, and slash damage, or pierce damage and slash damage. Explaining that a single weapon can do 2 or 3 of those types of damage and showing how they are done could be very useful. Also, same thing for some of the resistances. Like early on in the game, maybe if in the original tutorial area, you had dummies that reacted to blunt damage, pierce damage, or slash damage, and really illustrated how each of those different damage types impact how much damage a person's doing. Just be able to show them exactly the difference and how much more useful it is if they use the right type of weapon, how much more damage they can do. Also, like, put an area where a character is exposed to all the different types of status effects so they know what the status effects do, so you're not learning that mid-game. Just showing people rather than telling is just, it would be so helpful. Another issue is in the actual tutorial areas, in Demon Souls and Dark Souls, the tutorial messages themselves are shown in the same way that in-game messages are shown. And this is a problem because early on in the game, you're basically training a new player to look to these messages as objective truth and as tooltips. But as soon as you get out of this tutorial area, they can be written by any person on the internet who decides that they want to write a message. And sometimes there'll be messages that just say, like, jump off a cliff. And it puts you in a situation where the new player is trained to treat these messages as useful, and then as soon as they get out of this incubator, it just flips on them and can be completely useless or really useful. It's just an odd bit of conditioning, and I think it probably would be a bigger source of frustration than anything else. Maybe keeping some of this tutorialization in narration instead of in missable button prompts would be a little bit easier for a new player to digest, and it would ensure that the new player doesn't just completely lose some of the basic functionality. Also, forcing a player to use those tutorial button prompts would be useful. Another thing is in the tutorial sections, I think that these games need to include a section where there is a trap that, like right here in Dark Souls, that rolls down a stairs and tries to kill you, and maybe a couple of ambushes, because the Souls series really features a lot of those. And if you're not prepared and really conditioned to expect enemies to jump at you around every corner, it can just get really frustrating when you happen across 2 or 3 of those areas in a row. Avoiding a hidden trap is really rewarding. Getting jumped by it and dying is really frustrating. So condition people early. Now in Dark Souls 2, they actually corrected that mistake with the message. They instead made all the tutorial messages a kind of plaque. But again, it's something that you can run past and avoid the tutorialization by accident. So I think that that's a step in the right direction, but not as good as something like narration or forced prompts that people can't avoid. Another thing is, you can actually run through the tutorial area in Dark Souls 2 without actually participating in the tutorials if you don't step through the fog door. If you just run down the main path, you will avoid the tutorial, and a new player might do it by accident again. Another big change I would suggest is maybe explain how crafting and how blacksmithing works in the Souls games. In Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2, your blacksmith is locked effectively at the beginning of the game. In Dark Souls, you have to actually find the blacksmith. In Dark Souls 2, you have to find a key to unlock the blacksmith's blacksmithery. And if you don't do it, that entire system is locked off to you. And for a new player, you might not know where the blacksmith is. You might not know where the blacksmith's key is. You might never find either of those things, in which case you're making this game a lot harder because 1 or 2 upgrades to your weapon just does so much more damage than all your stats do. It's such a huge boon to have those things early on that it really does a disservice to the game to lock it behind a gate. Another thing is the Maiden in Black and the Emerald Maiden. Each of them govern leveling up in Demon Souls and Dark Souls 2 respectively, but again, it's an NPC that the player could wander by without knowing their function. Tying leveling up and the very basic systems to a missable character And the game wouldn't tell you that you walked by the character who levels you up, but you could do it, and you could just go a whole lot of time without realizing that you can level up or how you would even do it, especially with the Emerald Maiden, who you have to talk to a few times before she even suggests leveling you up. It just seems like an unnecessary hurdle for a new player to get through. So maybe just point the new player in the direction of the level up character and have them level up once or twice as an example. Another thing is just the purchasing system. Having all these items that are just available at the get-go without really telling the player how each of these pieces of equipment will impact them. Now, you can see in a very literal sense how these pieces of equipment will raise your stats, but you might not be able to put that into a context of saying, okay, this is something that's meaningful. Like, boosting your poison resistances early in the game might not actually be significant, but boosting your, resistance to physical damage by 20% would be very significant, but a new player doesn't necessarily know that. So maybe streamline the item buying process a little bit and be a little bit more explanatory with the basic early items. Another big thing is pointing players in the right direction when you start the game. Now, in the Souls series, the motto for how to figure out where you're supposed to go next is basically, where can I go where I won't die instantly? Now, this will eventually steer you in the right direction if you are patient enough to find, an area that's easier. However, if you don't know that that's the way these games work, it's very easy to just slam your head against a wall thinking that this is the only direction to go without exploring further, because the game doesn't really tell you to explore. It kind of implicitly expects you to explore. Now, in Dark Souls 1, the first place I went was to the skeleton graveyard, and I thought for a good 10-20 minutes that that was where I was supposed to go. I eventually figured out that I needed to go someplace else, but I could easily see someone who is used to having a little bit more guidance just kind of giving up. In Dark Souls 2, again, I didn't find the Forest of Fallen Giants for a while because I ended up finding the path to the Tower of Flame first, and that was another just big frustrating experience because I couldn't find the pathway to the basic starting area. Now, once you get out of the starting area, that's fine, but making a player who might not be familiar with this series at all figure out just the basic place where they need to go, it's just an unnecessary hurdle that will cause you to lose players. It'll cause people to put the game down instead of figuring out these more complex systems. And another thing with the Forest of Fallen Giants is the path to the bonfire is kind of off to the side. It is not, if you follow the enemies like most games would have you do, it'll actually take you further away from the point where you're safe. So maybe putting the very first bonfire in a very obvious place, like in Dark Souls 1, it's really useful. Putting it near the very first dungeon, useful. I think it saves a lot of headaches. I think it's just a little bit of level design that will save someone some time and some frustration. And the last thing, I think, is that the Souls series should really teach you how to approach bosses and how this game handles encounters early on. Dark Souls 1 does a pretty good job of this by throwing a boss at you very early and telling you to run away. I think a better way to handle this would maybe be put a bonfire or the bonfire equivalent right in front of a boss door, send a character in against that boss, and then give just snippets of narration that give you tips on how to defeat this boss, just one at a time, and every time you die, it gives you a new snippet and a new hint. That way, players understand that the way you get better and beat bosses in this game is by learning and improving within yourself. That leveling is sometimes not the answer, though it works most of the time. The real goal of Dark Souls is that you grow, not necessarily that your character grows. And so just teaching it by having the player do it, I think would be useful. It would help hone the decision-making process so that players kind of intuit the right way to play. And so I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope some of these suggestions made sense. If they did, let me know. If you think that you have some better suggestions, or if you think I'm full of crap, go ahead and let me know. If you like this video, like and subscribe. And thanks for watching. Peace!